This is a reading of the public domain book, A Honeymoon in Space by George Chetwynd Griffith. Chapter 13. While Zadie was talking, the Astronef was sweeping swiftly down towards the surface of Venus, through scenery of whose almost inconceivable magnificence no human words could convey any adequate idea. Underneath the cloud veil the air was absolutely clear and transparent, clearer indeed than terrestrial air at the highest elevations reached by mountain climbers, and, moreover, it seemed to be endowed with a strange, luminous quality, which made objects, no matter how distant, stand out with almost startling distinctness. The rivers and lakes and seas which spread out beneath them seemed never to have been ruffled by blast of storm or breath of wind, and their surfaces shone with a soft, silvery light, which seemed to come from below rather than from above. "If this isn't heaven, it must be the halfway house," said Redgrave, with what was, perhaps under the circumstances, a pardonable irreverence. "Still, after all, we don't know what the inhabitants may be like, so I think we'd better close the doors and drop on the top of that mountain spur running out between the two rivers into the bay. Do you notice how curious the water looks after the earth seas, bright silver instead of blue and green?" "Oh, it's just lovely," said Zadie. "Let's go down and have a walk. There's nothing to be afraid of. You'll never make me believe that a world like this can be inhabited by anything dangerous." "Perhaps, but we mustn't forget what happened on Mars, Madonna mia. Still, there's one thing. We haven't been tackled by any aerial fleets yet. I don't think the people here want airships. They can fly themselves. Look, there are a lot of them coming to meet us. That was a rather wicked remark of yours, Lennox, about the halfway house to heaven, but those certainly do look something like angels." As Zadie said this, after a somewhat lengthy pause, during which the Astronef had descended to within a few 100 feet of the mountain spur, she handed her field glasses to her husband and pointed downwards towards an island which lay a couple or miles or so off the end of the spur. He put the glasses to his eyes and took a long look through them. Moving them slowly up and down, and from side to side, he saw hundreds of winged figures rising from the island and floating towards them. "You were right, dear," he said, without taking the glass from his eyes, "and so was I. If those aren't angels, they're certainly something like men, and I suppose women too who can fly. We may as well stop here and wait for them. I wonder what sort of an animal they take the Astronef for." He sent a message down the tube to Murgatroyd and gave a turn and a half to the steering wheel. The propellers slowed down and the Astronef dropped with a hardly perceptible shock in the midst of a little plateau covered with a thick soft moss of a pale yellowish green and fringed by a belt of trees which seemed to be over 300 feet high and whose foliage was a deep golden bronze. They had scarcely landed before the flying figures reappeared over the treetops and swept downwards in long spiral curves towards the Astronef. "If they're not angels, they're very like them," said Zadie, putting down her glasses. "There's one thing. They fly a lot better than the old masters' angels or Dores could have done because they have tails, or at least something that seems to serve the same purpose, and yet they haven't got feathers. Yes, they have, at least round the edges of their wings or whatever they are, and they've got clothes too, silk tunics or something of that sort, and there are men and women. You're quite right. Those fringes down their legs are feathers, and that's how they can fly. They seem to have 4 arms. The flying figures which came hovering near to the Astronef without evincing any apparent sign of fear were the strangest that human eyes had looked upon. In some respects they had a sufficient resemblance for them to be taken for winged men and women, while in another they bore a decided resemblance to birds. Their bodies and limbs were human in shape, but of slenderer and lighter build, and from the shoulder blades and muscles of the back there sprang a second pair of arms arching up above their heads. Between these and the lower arms, and continued from them down the side to the ankles, there appeared to be a flexible membrane covered with a light feathery down, pure white on the inside, but on the back a brilliant golden yellow, deepening to bronze towards the edges, round which ran a deep feathery fringe. A body was covered in front and down the back, between the wings, with a sort of divided tunic of a light, silken-looking material, which must have been clothing, since there were many different colours, all more or less of different hue among them. Below this, and attached to the inner sides of the leg from the knee downward, was another membrane which reached down to the heels, and it was this which Redgrave somewhat flippantly alluded to as a tail. Its obvious purpose was to maintain the longitudinal balance when flying. In stature, the inhabitants of the Love Star varied from about 5 feet 6 to 5 feet, but both the taller and the shorter of them were all of nearly the same size, from which it was easy to conclude that this difference in stature was on Venus as well as on the Earth, one of the broad distinctions between the sexes. They flew round the Astronef with an exquisite ease and grace which made Zadie exclaim, "Now, why weren't we made like that on Earth?" To which Redgrave, after a look at the barometer, replied, "Partly, I suppose, because we weren't built that way, and partly because we don't live in an atmosphere about 2.5 times as dense as ours." Then several of the winged figures alighted on the mossy covering of the plain and walked towards the vessel. "Why, they walk just like us, only much more prettily," said Zadie. "And look what funny little faces they've got, half bird, half human, and soft downy feathers instead of hair. I wonder whether they talk or sing. I wish you'd open the doors again, Lennox. I'm sure they can't possibly mean us any harm. They are far too pretty for that. What lovely soft eyes they have, and what 1,000 pities it is we shan't be able to understand them." They had left the conning tower, and both his lordship and Murgatroyd were throwing open the sliding doors and, to Zadie's considerable displeasure, getting the deck maxims ready for action in case they should be required. As soon as the doors were open, Zadie's judgment of the inhabitants of Venus was entirely justified. Without the slightest sign of fear, but with very evident astonishment in their round golden yellow eyes, they came walking close up to the sides of the Astronef. Some of them stroked her smooth, shining sides with their little hands, which Zadie now found had only 3 fingers and a thumb. Many ages before they might have been birds' claws, but now they were soft and pink and plump, utterly strange to manual work as it is understood upon Earth. "Just fancy getting Maxim guns ready to shoot those delightful things," said Zadie, almost indignantly, as she went towards the doorway from which the gangway ladder ran down to the soft, mossy turf. "Why, not one of them has got a weapon of any sort, and just listen," she went on, stopping in the opening of the doorway. "Have you ever heard music like that on Earth? I haven't. I suppose it's the way they talk. I'd give a good deal to be able to understand them. But still, it's very lovely, isn't it?" "Ay, like the voices of sirens," said Murgatroyd, speaking for the first time since the Astronef had landed, for this big, grizzled, taciturn Yorkshireman, who looked upon the whole cruise through space as a mad and almost impious adventure, which nothing but his hereditary loyalty to his master's name and family could have persuaded him to share in, had grown more and more silent as the millions of miles between the Astronef and his native Yorkshire village had multiplied day by day. "Sirens, and why not, Andrew?" laughed Redgrave. "At any rate, I don't think they look likely to lure us and the Astronef to destruction." Then he went on, "Yes, Zadie, I never heard anything like that before. Unearthly, of course it is, but then we're not on Earth. Now, Zadie, they seem to talk in song language. You did pretty well on Mars with your American. Suppose we go out and show them that you can speak the song language too." "What do you mean?" she said. "Sing them something?" "Yes," he replied. "They'll try to talk to you in song, and you won't be able to understand them, at least, not as far as words and sentences go. But music is the universal language on Earth, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be the same through the solar system. Come along, tune up, little woman." They went together down the gangway stairs, he dressed in an ordinary suit of grey English tweed, with a golf cap on the back of his head, and she in the last and daintiest of the costumes which the art of Paris and London and New York had produced before the Astronef soared up from far-off Washington. The moment that she set foot on the golden yellow sward, she was surrounded by a swarm of the winged and yet strangely human creatures. Those nearest to her came and touched her hands and face and stroked the folds of her dress. Others looked into her violet blue eyes, and others put out their queer little hands and stroked her hair. This and her clothing seemed to be the most wonderful experience for them, saving always the fact that she had only 2 arms and no wings. Redgrave kept close beside her until he was satisfied that these exquisite inhabitants of the new-found fairyland were innocent of any intention of harm. And when he saw 2 of the winged daughters of the Love Star put up their hands and touch the thick coils of her hair, he said, "Take those pins and things out and let it down. They seem to think that your hair's part of your head. It's the first chance you've had to work a miracle, so you may as well do it. Show them the most beautiful thing they've ever seen." "What babies you men can be when you get sentimental," laughed Zadie, as she put her hands up to her head. "How do you know that this may not be ugly in their eyes?" "Quite impossible," he replied. "They're a great deal too pretty themselves to think you ugly. Let it down." While he was speaking, Zadie had taken off a Spanish mantilla, which she had thrown over her head as she came out, and which the ladies of Venus seemed to think was part of her hair. Then she took out the comb, and 1 or 2 hairpins which kept the coils in position, deftly caught the ends, and then, after a few rapid movements of her fingers, she shook her head, and the wondering crowd about her saw what seemed to them a shimmering veil, half gold, half silver, in the soft reflected light from the cloud veil, fall down from her head over her shoulders. They crowded still more closely round her, but so quietly and so gently that she felt nothing more than the touch of wondering hands on her arms and dress and hair. As Redgrave said afterwards, he was absolutely out of it. They seemed to imagine him to be a kind of uncouth monster, possibly the slave of this radiant being which had come so strangely from somewhere beyond the cloud veil. They looked at him with their golden yellow eyes wide open, and some of them came up rather timidly and touched his clothes, which they seemed to think were his skin. Then 1 or 2, more daring, put their little hands up to his face and touched his moustache, and all of them, while both examinations were going on, kept up a running conversation of cooing and singing, which evidently conveyed their ideas from one to the other on the subject of this most marvellous visit of these 2 strange beings with neither wings nor feathers, but who, most undoubtedly, had other means of flying, since it was quite certain that they had come from another world. Their ordinary speech was a low crooning note, like the language in which doves converse, mingled with a twittering current of undertone. But every moment it rose into higher notes, evidently expressing wonder or admiration, or both. "You were right about the universal language," said Redgrave, when he had submitted to the stroking process for a few moments. "These people talk in music, and as far as I can see or hear, their opinion of us, or at least of you, is distinctly flattering. I don't know what they take me for, and I don't care, but as we'd better make friends with them, suppose you sing them Home, Sweet Home, or the Swanee River. I shouldn't wonder if they consider our talking voices most horrible discords, so you might as well give them something different." While he was speaking, the sounds about them suddenly hushed, and, as Redgrave said afterwards, it was something like the silence that follows a cannon shot. Then, in the midst of the hush, Zaidie put her hands behind her, looked up towards the luminous silver surface which formed the only visible sky of Venus, and began to sing the Swanee River. The clear, sweet notes rang up through the midst of a sudden silence. The sons and daughters of the love star instantly ceased their own soft musical conversation, and Zaidie sang the old plantation song through for the first time that a human voice had sung it to ears other than human. As the last note thrilled sweetly from her lips, she looked round at the crowd of queer half-human shapes about her, and something in their unlikeness to her own kind brought back to her mind the familiar scenes which lay so far away, so many millions of miles, across the dark and silent ocean of space. Other winged figures, attracted by the sound of her singing, had crossed the trees, and these, during the silence which came after the singing of the song, were swiftly followed by others, until there were nearly 1,000 of them gathered about the side of the Astronef. There was no crowding or jostling among them. Each one treated every other with the most perfect gentleness and courtesy. No such thing as enmity or ill feeling seemed to exist among them, and, in perfect silence, they waited for Zaidie to continue what they thought was her long speech of greeting. The temper of the throng somehow coincided exactly with the mood which her own memories had brought to her, and the next moment she sent the first line of Home, Sweet Home soaring up to the cloud-veiled sky. As the notes rang up into the still, soft air, a deeper hush fell on the listening throng. Heads were bowed with a gesture almost of adoration, and many of those standing nearest to her bent their bodies forward and expanded their wings, bringing them together over their breasts with a motion which, as they afterwards learnt, was intended to convey the idea of wonder and admiration, mingled with something like a sentiment of worship. Zaidie sang the sweet old song through from end to end, forgetting for the time being everything but the home she had left behind her on the banks of the Hudson. As the last notes left her lips, she turned round to Redgrave and looked at him with eyes dim with the first tears that had filled them since her father's death, and said, as he caught hold of her outstretched hand, "I believe they've understood every word of it, or, at any rate, every note. You may be quite certain of that," he replied. "If you had done that on Mars, it might have been even more effective than the Maxims. For goodness sake, don't talk about things like that in a heaven like this. Oh, listen. They've got the tune already." It was true. The dwellers of the Love Star, whose speech was song, had instantly recognized the sweetness of the sweetest of all earthly songs. They had, of course, no idea of the meaning of the words, but the music spoke to them and told them that this fair visitant from another world could speak the same speech as theirs. Every note and cadence was repeated with absolute fidelity, and so the speech, common to the two far-distant worlds, became a link connecting this wandering son and daughter of the earth with the sons and daughters of the love star. The throng fell back a little, and two figures, apparently male and female, came to Zadie and held out their right hands and began addressing her in perfectly harmonized song, which, though utterly unintelligible to her in the sense of speech, expressed sentiments which could not possibly be mistaken, as there was a faint suggestion of the old English song running through the little song speech that they made. And both Zadie and her husband rightly concluded that it was intended to convey a welcome to the strangers from beyond the cloud veil. And then the strangest of all possible conversations began. Redgrave, who had no more notion of music than a walrus, perforce kept silence. In fact, he noticed with a certain displeasure, which vanished speedily with a musical and half-malicious little laugh from Zadie, that when he spoke the bird, folk drew back a little and looked in something like astonishment at him. But Zadie was already in touch with them, and half by song and half by signs, she very soon gave them an idea of what they were and where they had come from. Her husband afterwards told her that it was the best piece of operatic acting he had ever seen, and, considering all the circumstances, this was very possibly true. In the end, the two who had come to give her what seemed to be the formal greeting were invited into the Astronef. They went on board without the slightest sign of mistrust, and with only an expression of mild wonder on their beautiful and strangely childlike faces. Then, while the other doors were being closed, Zadie stood at the open one above the gangway and made signs showing that they were going up beyond the clouds and then down into the valley. And as she made the signs she sang through the scale, her voice rising and falling in harmony with her gestures. And the birdfolk understood her instantly, and as the door closed and the Astronef rose from the ground, 1,000 wings were outspread, and presently hundreds of beautiful soaring forms were circling about the navigator of the stars. "Don't they look lovely?" said Zadie. "I wonder what they would think if they could see us flying above New York or London or Paris with an escort like this. I suppose they're going to show us the way. Perhaps they have a city down there. Suppose you were to go and get a bottle of champagne and see if Master Cupid and Miss Venus would like a drink. We'll see then if our nectar is anything like theirs." Redgrave went below. Meanwhile, for lack of other possible conversation, Zadie began to sing the last verse of Never Again. The melody almost exactly described the upward motion of the Astronef, and she could see that it was instantly understood, for when she had finished their two voices joined in an almost exact imitation of it. When Redgrave brought up the wine and the glasses, they looked at them without any sign of surprise. The pop of the cork did not even make them look round. Evidently a semi-angelic people, living on nectar and ambrosia, with nectar very like our own, he said as he filled the glasses. "Perhaps you'd better give it to them. They seem to understand you better than they do me, you being, of course, a good bit nearer to the angels than I am." "Thanks," she said, as she took a couple of glasses up, wondering a little what their visitors would do with them. Somewhat to her surprise, they took them with a little bow and a smile and sipped at the wine, first with a swift glint of wonder in their eyes, and then with smiles which are unmistakable evidence of perfect appreciation. "I thought so," said Redgrave, as he raised his own glass and bowed gravely towards them. "This is our nearest approach to nectar, and they seem to recognize it. And don't they just look like the sort of people who live on it, and, of course, other things?" added Zadie, as she too lifted her glass and looked with laughing eyes across the brim at her two guests. But meanwhile, Murgatroyd had been applying the repulsive force a little too strongly. The Astronef shot up with a rapidity which soon left her winged escort far below. She entered the cloud veil and passed beyond it. The instant that the unclouded sunrays struck the glass roofing of the deck chamber, their two guests, who had been moving about examining everything with a childlike curiosity, closed their eyes and clasped their hands over them, uttering little cries, tuneful and musical, but still with a note of strange discord in them. "Lennox, we must go down again," exclaimed Zadie. "Don't you see they can't stand the light? It hurts them. Perhaps, poor dears, it's the first time they've ever been hurt in their lives. I don't believe they have any of our ideas of pain or sorrow or anything of that sort. Take us back under the clouds, quick, or we may blind them." Before she had ceased speaking, Redgrave had sent a signal down to Murgatroyd, and the Astronef began to drop back again towards the surface of the cloud sea. Zadie had meanwhile gone to her lady guest and dropped the black lace mantilla over her head, and, as she did so, she caught herself saying, "There, dear, we shall soon be back in your own light. I hope it hasn't hurt you. It was very stupid of us to do a thing like that." The answer came in a little cooing murmur, which said, "Thank you," quite as effectively as any earthly words could have done, and then the Astronef passed through the cloud sea. The soaring forms of her lost escort came into view again and clustered about her, and, surrounded by them, she dropped, in obedience to their signs, down between the tremendous mountains and towards the island, thick with golden foliage, which lay 2 or 3 earth miles out in a bay, where 4 converging rivers spread out through a vast estuary into the sea. As Lady Redgrave said afterwards to Mrs. Van Stuyler, she could have filled a whole volume with a description of the exquisitely Arcadian delights with which the hours of the next 10 days and nights were filled. Possibly, if she had been able to do justice to them, even her account might have been received with qualified credence. But still some idea of them may be gathered from this extract of a conversation which took place in the saloon of the Astronef on the 11th evening. "But look here, Zaidie," said Redgrave, "as we've found a world which is certainly much more delightful than our own, why shouldn't we stop here a bit? The air suits us, and the people are simply enchanting. I think they like us, and I'm sure you're in love with every one of them, male and female. Of course, it's rather a pity that we can't fly unless we do it in the Astronef, but that's only a detail. You're enjoying yourself thoroughly, and I never saw you looking better or, if possible, more beautiful, and why on earth, or Venus, do you want to go?" She looked at him steadily for a few moments, and with an expression which he had never seen on her face or in her eyes before, and then she said slowly and very sweetly, although there was something like a note of solemnity running through her tone, "I altogether agree with you, dear, but there is something which you don't seem to have noticed. As you say, we have had a perfectly delightful time. It's a delicious world, and just everything that one would think it to be. But if we were to stop here, we should be committing one of the greatest of crimes, perhaps the greatest, that ever was committed within the limits of the solar system." "My dear Zaidie, what, in the name of what we used to call morals on the earth, do you mean?" "Just this," she replied, leaning a little towards him in her deck chair. "These people, half angels and half men and women, welcomed us after we dropped through their cloud veil. As friends, we were a little strange to them, certainly, but still they welcomed us as friends. They had no suspicions of us. They didn't try to poison us or blow us up as those wretches on Mars did. They're just like a lot of grown-up children with wings on. In fact, they're about as nearly angels as anything we can think of. They've taken us into their palaces. They've given us, as one might say, the whole planet. Everything was ours that we liked to take. You know we have 200 or 300 weight of precious stones on board now, which they would make me take just because they saw my rings. We've been living with them 10 days now, and neither you nor I, nor even Murgatroyd, who, like the old Puritan that he is, seems to see sin or wrong in everything that looks nice, has seen a single sign among them that they know anything about what we call sin or wrong on earth. There's no jealousy, no selfishness. In short, no envy, hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness, no vice or meanness or cheating or any of the abominations of the planet Terra, and we come from that planet. Do you see what I mean now?" "I think I understand what you're driving at," said Redgrave. "You mean, I suppose, that this world is something like Eden before the fall, and that you and I— Oh, but that's all rubbish, you know. I've got my own share of original sin, of course, but here it doesn't seem to come in, and as for you, the very idea of you imagining yourself a feminine edition of the serpent in Eden, nonsense." She got up out of her chair and, leaning over his, put her arm round his shoulder. Then she said very softly, "I see you understand what I mean, Lennox. That's just it. Original sin. It doesn't matter how good you think me or I think you, but we have it. You're an earthborn man, and I'm an earthborn woman, and, as I'm your wife, I can say it plainly. We may think a good bit of each other, but that's no reason why we might not be a couple of plague spots in a sinless world like this. Surely you see what I mean. I needn't put it plainer, need I?" Their eyes met, and he read her meaning in hers. He put his arm up over her shoulder and drew her down towards him. Their lips met, and then he got up and went down to the engine room. A couple of minutes later the Astronef sprang upwards from the midst of the delightful valley in which she was resting. No lights were shown. In 5 minutes she had passed through the cloud veil, and the next morning, when their new friends came to visit them and found that they had vanished back into space, there was sorrow for the first time among the sons and daughters of the Love Star. Chapter 14. 500 million miles from the Earth, and 47 million miles from Jupiter, said Redgrave, as he came into breakfast on the morning of the 28th day after leaving Venus. During this brief period, the Astronef had recrossed the orbits of the Earth and Mars, and had passed through that marvelous region of the solar system, the belt of the asteroids. Nearly 100 million miles of their journey had lain through this zone in which hundreds and possibly thousands of tiny planets revolve in vast orbits round the Sun. Then had come a world less void of over 300 million miles, through which they voyaged alone, surrounded by the ever-constant splendors of the heavens, and visited only now and then by one of those spectres of space which we call comets. Astern the disk of the Sun steadily diminished, and ahead the grey-blue shape of Jupiter, the giant of the solar system, had grown larger and larger. Until now they could see it as it had never been seen before. A gigantic three-quarter moon filling up the whole heavens in front of them, almost from zenith to nadir. 3 of its satellites, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, were distinctly visible even to the naked eye, and Europa and Ganymede happened to be in such a position in regard to the Astronef that her crew could see not only the bright sides turned towards the Sun, but also the black shadow spots which they cast on the cloud-veiled face of the huge planet. Callisto was above the horizon, hanging like a tiny flicker of yellowish-red light above the rounded edge of Jupiter, and Io was invisible behind the planet. 500 million miles, said Zadie, with a little shiver. That seems an awful long way from home, I mean America, doesn't it? I often wonder what they are thinking about us on the dear old Earth. I don't suppose anyone ever expects to see us again. However, it's no good getting homesick in the middle of a journey when you're outward bound. And now what is the program, as regards His Majesty King Jove? We shall visit the satellites, of course. Certainly, replied Redgrave. In fact, I shouldn't be surprised if our visit was confined to them. What? Do you mean to say we shan't land on Jupiter after coming nearly 600 million miles to see him? That would be disappointing, but why not? Don't you think he's ready to be visited yet? I can't say that, but you must remember that no one has the remotest notion of what there is behind the clouds or whatever they are which form those bands. All we really know about Jupiter is that he is of enormous size. For instance, he's over 1,200 times bigger than the Earth, and that his density isn't much greater than that of water. And my humble opinion is that if we're able to go through the clouds without getting the Astronef red hot, we shall find that Jupiter is in the same state as the Earth was a good many million years ago. I see, said Zadie. You mean just a mass of blazing, boiling rock and metal which will make islands and continents some day, and that what we call the cloud bands are the vapours which will one day make it seas. Well, if we can get through these clouds, we ought to see something worth seeing. Just fancy a whole world as big as that, all ablaze like molten iron. Do you think we shall be able to see it, Lennox? I'm not so sure about that, little woman. We shall have to go to work rather cautiously. You see, Jupiter is far bigger than any world we've visited yet, and if we got too close to him, the Astronef's engines might not be powerful enough to drive us away again. Then we should either stop there till the R-force was exhausted, or be drawn towards him, and perhaps drop into an ocean of molten rock and metal. Thanks, said Zadie with a shrug of her shapely shoulders. That would be an ignominious end to a journey like this, to say nothing of the boiling oil part of it, so I suppose you'll make stopping places of the satellites, and use their attraction to help you to resist His Majesty's. Your ladyship's reasoning is perfect. I propose to visit them in turn, beginning with Callisto. I shouldn't be at all surprised if we found something interesting on them. You know they're quite little worlds of themselves. They're all bigger than our moon, except Europa. Ganymede, in fact, is 2/3 bigger than Mercury, and if old Jupiter is still in a state of fiery incandescence, there's no reason why we shouldn't find on Ganymede or one of the others the same state of things that existed on our moon when the Earth was blazing hot. I shouldn't wonder, said Zadie. I've often heard my father say that that was probably what happened. It's all very marvellous, isn't it? Death in one place, life in another, all beginnings and endings, and yet no actual beginning or end of anything anywhere. That's eternity, I suppose. It's just about as near as the finite intellect can get to it, I should say, replied Redgrave. But I don't think metaphysics are much in our line. If you've finished, we may as well go and have a look at the realities. Which the metaphysicians, laughed Zadie as she rose, would tell you are not realities at all, or only realities so far as you can think about them. Thinks, in short, instead of real things. But meanwhile I've got the breakfast things to put away, so you can go up on deck and put the telescopes in order. When she joined him a few minutes later in the deck chamber, the three-quarter disk of Jupiter was rapidly approaching the full. Its phases are invisible from the Earth owing to the enormous distance. But from the deck of the Astronef they had been plainly visible for some days, And, since the huge planet turns on its axis in less than 10 hours, or with more than twice the speed of the Earth's rotation, the phases followed each other very rapidly. Thus, at 12 o'clock noon by Astronef time, they might have seen a gigantic rim of silver blue overarching the whole vault of heaven in front of them. By 5 o'clock it would be a hemisphere, and by 5 minutes to 10, the vast sphere would be once more shining full orbed upon them. By 8 o'clock next morning, they would find Jupiter new again. They were now falling very rapidly towards the huge planet, and, since there is no up or down in space, the nearer they got to it, the more it appeared to sink below them and become, as it were, the floor of the celestial sphere. As the crescent approached the full, they were able to examine the mysterious bands as human observers had never examined them before. For hours they sat almost silent at their telescopes, trying to probe the mystery which has baffled human science since the days of Galileo, and gradually it became plain that Redgrave was correct in the hypothesis which he had derived from Flammarion and one or two others of the more advanced astronomers. "I believe I was right, or, in other words, those that I got the idea from are," he said, as they approached the orbit of Callisto, which revolves at a distance of about 1,100,000 miles from the surface of Jupiter. Those belts are made of clouds or vapour in some stage or other. The highest, the ones along the equator, and what we should call the temperate zones, are the highest and therefore coolest and whitest. The dark ones are the lowest and hottest. I dare say they are more like what we should call volcanic clouds. Do you see how they keep changing? That's what's bothered our astronomers. Look at that big one yonder, a bit to the north, going from brown to red. I suppose that's something like the famous red spot which they have been puzzling about. What do you make of it? Well, said Zadie, looking up from her telescope, it's quite certain that the glare must come from underneath. It can't be sunlight, because the poor old sun doesn't seem to have strength enough to make a decent sunset or sunrise here, and look how it's running along to the westward. What does that mean, do you think? I should say it means that some half-formed Jovian continent has been flung sky-high by a big burst up underneath, and that's the blaze of the incandescent stuff running along. Just fancy a continent, say 10 times the size of Asia, being split up and sent flying in a few moments like that. Look, there's another one to the north. On the whole, dear, I don't think we should find the climate on the other side of those clouds very salubrious. Still, as they say the atmosphere of Jupiter is about 10,000 miles thick, we may be able to get near enough to see something of what's going on. Meanwhile, here comes Callisto. Look at his shadow flying across the clouds. And there's Ganymede coming up after him, and Europa behind him. Talk about eclipses, they must be about as common here as thunderstorms are with us. We don't have a thunderstorm every day, at least not at home, corrected Zadie, but on Jupiter they must have 2 or 3 eclipses every day. Meanwhile, there goes Jupiter himself. What a difference distance makes. This little thing is only a trifle larger than our moon, and it's hiding everything else. As she was speaking, the full orbed disk of Callisto, measuring nearly 3,000 miles across, swept between them and the planet. It shone with a clear, somewhat reddish light like that of Mars. The Astronef was feeling his attraction strongly, and Redgrave went to the levers and turned on about 1/5 of the hour, forced to avoid too sudden contact with it. "Another dead world," said Redgrave, as the surface of Callisto revolved swiftly beneath them, or at any rate a dying one. There must be an atmosphere of some sort, or else that snow and ice wouldn't be there, and everything would be either black or white as it was on the moon. We may as well land, however, and get a specimen of the rocks and soil to add to the museum, though I don't expect there will be very much to see in the way of life. In another hour or so, the Astronef had dropped gently onto the surface of Callisto at the foot of a range of mountains, crowded with jagged and splintery peaks, and a mile or two from the edge of a sea of snow and ice which stretched away in a vast expanse of rugged frozen billows beyond the horizon. Redgrave, as usual, went into the air chamber and tried the atmosphere. A second's experience of it was enough for him. It was unbreathably thin and unbearably cold, although, when mixed with the air of the Astronef, it distinctly freshened it up. This proved that its composition was, or had been, fit for human respiration. "There's only one fault about it," he said, when he rejoined Zadie in the sitting-room. "You know what the schoolboy said when he started kissing his first sweetheart. It takes too long to get enough of it. You seem to be very fond of referring to that particular subject, Lennox." "Well, yes, to tell you the truth I am." And then he referred to it again in another form. After this they went and put on their breathing, dresses and went for a welcome stroll along the arid shores of the frozen sea after their lengthy confinement to the decks of the Astronef. The sun was still powerful enough to keep them comfortably warm in their dresses, and there was enough atmosphere to make this warmth diffused instead of direct. So they were able to step out briskly, and every now and then open their visors a little and take in a breath or two of the thin, sharp air, which they found quite exhilarating when mixed with the air supplied by their own oxygen apparatus. The attraction of the satellite being only a little more than that of the moon, or, say, about a fifth of that of the Earth. They were able to get along with a series of hops, skips and jumps, which might have looked rather ridiculous to terrestrial eyes, but which they found a very pleasant mode of locomotion. They were also able to climb the steepest mountainsides with no more trouble than they would have had in walking along a terrestrial plain. On the heights, they found no sign either of animal or vegetable life, only rocks and gravel and sand of a brownish red, apparently uniform in composition. They took a few lumps of rock and a canvas bag full of sand back with them from the mountainside. In the valley sloping towards the ice sea, they found what had once been watercourses opening out into rivers towards the sea, and in the lowest parts there was a kind of lichen growth clinging to the rocks under the snow. On the surface of the snow they saw traces of what might have been the tracks of animals, but, as there was no breath of wind in the attenuated atmosphere, it was quite possible that these might have been frozen into permanent shape hundreds or thousands of years before. It was also possible that if they had explored long enough, they might have found some low forms of animal life. But as they had landed almost on the equator of the satellite, under the full rays of the sun, and seen nothing, this was hardly likely. "I don't think it is worthwhile stopping here any longer," said Zadie, who was getting a little bit blazy with her interplanetary experiences. "We've got lots to see further on, so if you don't mind, I think I'll just take 2 or 3 photographs, then we can get back to the ship and have dinner and go on and see what Ganymede is like. He's bigger than Mercury and nearly as big as Mars, so we ought to find something interesting there. This is only a sort of combination of the moon and the polar regions, and I don't think very much of it. Suppose we go back." "Just as your ladyship pleases," laughed Redgrave over the wire, which connected their helmets, as with joined hands they turned back and danced along the snow-covered ocean shore towards the Astronef. Zadie took a couple of photographs of the mountain range and the ice sea, and another one of the general landscape of Callisto as they rose from the surface. Then, while she went to get lunch ready, Redgrave took the pieces of rock and the bag of dust into the laboratory which opened out of the main engine room and analysed them. When he came out about an hour later, he saw Murgatroyd going through his beloved engines with an oil can and a piece of common cotton waste, which had come from a faraway Yorkshire mill. "Andrew," he said, "should you be surprised if I told you that that moon we've just left seems to be mostly made of a spongy sort of alloy of gold and silver?" "My lord," said the old engineer, straightening himself up and looking at him with eyes in which this announcement had not seemed to kindle a spark of interest, "after what I have seen so far, there's nothing that'll surprise me, unless it be that the grace of God allows us to get back safely." "Amen, Andrew, that's well said," replied Redgrave, and then he went back to the saloon, and Murgatroyd went on with his oiling. When he told her ladyship of his discovery, she just looked up from the table she was laying and said, "Oh, indeed. Well, I'm very glad that it's 500 or 600 million miles from the Earth. A dead world bigger than the moon, and made of gold and silver sponge, wouldn't be a nice thing to have too near the Earth. There's trouble enough about that sort of thing at home as it is. Still, it'll be a nice addition to the museum, and if you'll put it away and go and wash your hands, lunch will be ready." When they got back to the deck chamber, Callisto was already a half-moon in the upper sky nearly 500,000 miles away, and the full orb of Ganymede, shining with a pale golden light, lay outspread beneath them. A thin, bluish-grey arc of the giant planet overarched its western edge. "I think we shall find something like a world here," said her ladyship, when she had taken her first look through her telescope. "There's an atmosphere, and what look like thin clouds. Continents and oceans too, or something like them. And what is that light shining up between the breaks? Isn't it something like our aurora?" "It might be," replied Redgrave, turning his own telescope towards the northern pole of Ganymede, "though I never heard of a satellite having an aurora. Perhaps it's the sun shining on the ice." As the Astronef fell towards the surface of Ganymede, she crossed his northern pole, and the nearer they got, the plainer it became, that a light very like the terrestrial aurora was playing about it, illuminating the thin yellow clouds with a bluish-violet light, which made magnificent contrasts of colouring amongst them. "Let us go down there and see what it's like," said Zadie. There must be something nice under all those lovely colours. Redgrave checked the R-force, and the Astronef fell obliquely across the pole towards the equator. As they approached the luminous clouds, Redgrave turned it on again, and they sank slowly through a glowing mist of innumerable colours until the surface of Ganymede came into plain view about 10 miles below them. What they saw then was the strangest sight they had beheld since they had left the Earth. As far as their eyes could reach, the surface of the Ganymede was covered with vast, orderly patches, mostly rectangular, of what they at first took for ice, but which they soon found to be a something that was self-illuminating. "Glorified hot houses, as I'm alive!" exclaimed Redgrave. "Whole cities under glass, fields, too, and lit by electricity, or something very like it. Zadie, we shall find human beings down there." "Well, if we do, I hope they won't be like the half-human things we found on Mars. But isn't it all just lovely? Only there doesn't seem to be anything outside the cities, at least nothing but bare, flat ground with a few rugged mountains here and there. See, there's a nice level plain there near the big glass city, or whatever it is. Suppose we go down there." Redgrave checked the after-engine, which was driving them obliquely over the surface of the satellite, and the Astronef fell vertically towards a bare, flat plain of what looked like deep yellow sand, which spread for miles alongside one of the glittering cities of glass. "Oh, look, they've seen us!" exclaimed Zadie. "I do hope they're going to be as friendly as those dear people on Venus were." "I hope so," replied Redgrave, "but if they're not, we've got the guns ready." As he said this, about 20 streams of an intense bluish light suddenly shot up all round them, concentrating themselves upon the hull of the Astronef, which was now about 1.5 miles from the surface. The light was so intense that the rays of the sun were lost in it. They looked at each other and found that their faces looked almost perfectly white in it. The plain and the city below had vanished. To look downwards was like staring straight into the focus of a 10,000 candle-power electric arc lamp. It was so intolerable that Redgrave closed the lower shutters, and meanwhile he found that the Astronef had ceased to descend. He shut off more of the R-force, but it produced no effect. The Astronef remained stationary. Then he ordered Murgatroyd to set the propellers in motion. The engineer pulled the starting levers and then came up out of the engine room and said to him, "It's no good, my lord. I don't know what devil's world we've got into now, but they won't work. If I thought that engines could be bewitched—" "Oh, nonsense, Andrew," said his lordship rather testily. "It's perfectly simple. Those people down there, whoever they are, have got some way of demagnetizing us, or else they've got the force too, and they're applying it against us to stop us going down. Apparently they don't want us. No, that's just to show us that they can stop us if they want to. The light's going down. Begin dropping a bit. Don't start the propellers, but just go and see that the guns are all right in case of accidents." The old engineer nodded and went back to his engines, looking considerably scared. As he spoke, the brilliancy of the light faded rapidly, and the Astronef began to sink slowly towards the surface. As a precaution against their being allowed to drop with force enough to cause a disaster, Redgrave turned the R-force on again, and they fell slowly towards the plain, through what seemed like a halo of perfectly white light. When she was within a couple of 100 yards of the ground, a winged car of exquisitely graceful shape rose from the roof of one of the huge glass buildings nearest to them, flew swiftly towards them, and after circling once round the dome of the upper deck, ran close alongside. The car was occupied by 2 figures of distinctly human form, but rather more than human stature. Both were dressed in long, close-fitting garments of what seemed like a golden-brown fleece. Their heads were covered with a close hood, and their hands with gloves. "What an exceedingly handsome man," said Zadie, as one of them stood up. "I never saw such a noble-looking face in my life. It's half philosopher, half saint. Of course you won't be jealous." "Oh, nonsense," he laughed. "It would be quite impossible to imagine you in love with either. But he is handsome, and evidently friendly. There's no mistaking that. Answer him, Zadie. You can do it better than I can." The car had now come close alongside. The standing figure stretched its hands out, palms upward, smiled a smile which Zadie thought was very sweetly solemn. Next the head was bowed, and the gloved hands brought back and crossed over his breast. Zadie imitated the movements exactly. Then, as the figure raised its head, she raised hers, and she found herself looking into a pair of large, luminous eyes, such as she could have imagined under the brows of an angel. As they met hers, a look of unmistakable wonder and admiration came into them. Redgrave was standing just behind her. She took him by the hand and drew him beside her, saying with a little laugh, Now, please look as pleasant as you can. I am sure they are very friendly. A man with a face like that couldn't mean any harm." The figure repeated the motions to Redgrave, who returned them, perhaps a trifle awkwardly. Then the car began to descend, and the figure beckoned to them to follow. "You'd better go and wrap up, dear. From the gentleman's dress it seems pretty cold outside, though the air is evidently quite breathable," said Redgrave, as the Astronef began to drop in company with the car. "At any rate, I'll try it first, and if it isn't, we can put on our breathing dresses." When Zadie had made her winter toilet, and Redgrave had found the air to be quite respirable, but of Arctic cold, they went down the gangway ladder about 20 minutes later. The figure had got out of the car, which was laying a few yards from them on the sandy plain, and came forward to meet them with both hands outstretched. Zadie unhesitatingly held out hers, and a strange thrill ran through her as she felt them for the first time clasped gently by other than earthly hands, for the Venus folk had only been able to pat and stroke with their gentle little paws, somewhat as a kitten might do. The figure bowed its head again and said something in a low, melodious voice, which was, of course, quite unintelligible, save for the evident friendliness of its tone. Then, releasing her hands, he took Redgrave's in the same fashion, and then led the way towards a vast, domed building of semi-opaque glass, or rather a substance that seemed to be something like a mixture of glass and mica, which appeared to be one of the entrance gates of the city. Chapter 15. The wondering visitors from far-off Terra had hardly halted before the magnificent portal when a huge sheet of frosted glass rose silently from the ground. They passed through, and it fell behind them. They found themselves in a great oval antechamber along each side of which stood triple rows of strangely shaped trees whose leaves gave off a subtle and most agreeable scent. The temperature here was several degrees higher, in fact about that of an English spring day, and Zadie immediately threw open her big fur cloak, saying, "These good people seem to live in winter gardens, don't they? I don't think I shall want these things much while we're inside. I wonder what dear old Andrew would have thought of this if we could have persuaded him to leave the ship." They followed their host through the antechamber towards a magnificent pointed arch raised on clusters of small pillars, each of a differently coloured, highly polished stone which shone brilliantly in a light which seemed to come from nowhere. Another door, this time of pale, transparent blue glass, rose as they approached. They passed under it, and as it fell behind them 6 figures, considerably shorter and slighter than their host, came forward to meet them. He took off his gloves and cape and thick outer covering, and they were glad to follow his example, for the atmosphere was now that of a warm June day. The attendants, as they evidently were, took their wraps from them, looking at the furs and stroking them with evident wonder, but with nothing like the wonder which came into their big, soft grey eyes when they looked at Zadie, who, as usual when she arrived on a new world, was arrayed in one of her daintiest costumes. Their host was now dressed in a tunic of a light blue material, which glistened with a lustre greater than that of the finest silk. It reached a little below his knees, and was confined at the waist by a sash of the same colour, but of somewhat deeper hue. His feet and legs were covered with stockings of the same material and colour, and his feet, which were small for his stature and exquisitely shaped, were shod with thin sandals of a material which looked like soft felt, and which made no noise as he walked over the delicately coloured mosaic pavement of the street, for such it actually was, which ran past the gate. When he removed his cape, they expected to find that he was bald like the Martians, but they were mistaken. His well-shaped head was covered with long, thick hair of a colour, something between bronze and grey. A broad band of metal looking like light gold passed round the upper part of his forehead, and from under this the hair fell in gentle waves to below his shoulders. For a few moments, Zadie and Redgrave stared about them in frank and silent wonder. They were standing in a broad street running in a straight line to what seemed to be several miles along the edge of a city of crystal. It was lined with double rows of trees, with beds of brilliantly coloured flowers between them. From this street, others went off at right angles and at regular intervals. The roof of the city appeared to be composed of an infinity of domes of enormous extent, supported by tall clusters of slender pillars standing at the street corners. The general level of the roof seemed about 300 feet above the ground, and the summits of the domes some 50 feet higher. The houses, which were all square, were, as a rule, about 40 feet high. The roofs were covered with gardens and shrubberies, from which creepers, bearing brilliantly coloured leaves and flowers, hung down about the windows in carefully arranged festoons. The walls were composed of the opaque mica-like glass, relieved by pillars and arched doorways and windows. The windows, of French form, were of clear glass, and mostly stood open. A sweet, cool zephyr of hardly perceptible strength appeared to be blowing along the street and over the housetops and in the vast airy space above the roofs. Brightly plumaged birds were flitting about among the branches of giant trees and keeping up a perpetual chorus of song. Presently their host touched Redgrave on the shoulder and pointed to a four-wheeled car of light framework and exquisite design, containing seats for four besides the driver, or guide, who sat behind. He held out his hand to Zadie and handed her to one of the front seats just as an earthborn gentleman might have done. Then he motioned to Redgrave to sit beside her and mounted behind them. The car immediately began to move silently, but with considerable speed, along the left-hand side of the outer street, which, like all the others, was divided by narrow strips of russet-coloured grass and flowering shrubs. In a few minutes it swung round to the right, crossed the road, and entered a magnificent avenue, which, after a run of some 4 miles, ended in a vast park-like square, measuring at least a mile each way. The two sides of the avenue were busy with cars like their own, some carrying 6 people, and others only the driver. Those on each side of the road all went in the same direction. Those nearest to the broad sidewalks between the houses and the first row of trees went at a moderate speed of 5 or 6 miles an hour. But along the inner sides, near the central line of trees, they seemed to be running as high as 30 miles an hour. Their occupants were nearly all dressed in clothes made of the same glistening, silky fabric as their host wore, but the colourings were of infinite variety. It was quite easy to distinguish between the sexes, although in stature they were almost equal. The men were nearly all clothed as their host was. The colours of their garments were quieter, and there was little attempt at personal adornment, though many wore bands of an intensely bright sky-blue metal round their arms above the elbow, and others wore belts and necklaces of links composed of this and 2 other metals resembling gold and aluminium, but of an exceedingly high lustre. The women were dressed in flowing garments, something after the Greek style, but they were of brighter hues and much more lavishly embroidered than the men's tunics were. They also wore much more jewellery. Indeed, some of the younger ones glittered from head to foot with polished metal and gleaming stones. There was one more difference which they quickly noticed. The men's hair, like their hosts', was nearly always wavy, but that of the women, especially the younger, was a mass of either natural or artificial curls, short and crisp about the head, and flowing down in glistening ringlets to their waists. "Could anyone ever have dreamt of such a lovely place?" said Zadie, after their wondering eyes had become accustomed to the marvels about them. "And yet, oh dear, now I know what it reminds me of. Flammarion's book, The End of the World, where he describes the remnants of the human race dying of cold and hunger on the equator in places something like this. I suppose the life of poor Ganymede is giving out, and that's why they've got to live in magnified exposition buildings, poor things." "Poor things," laughed Redgrave. "I'm afraid I can't agree with you there, dear. I never saw a jollier-looking lot of people in my life. I dare say you're quite right, but they certainly seem to view their approaching end with considerable equanimity. Don't be horrid, Lennox. Fancy talking in that cold-blooded way about such delightful-looking people as these. Why, they are even nicer than our dear bird-folk on Venus, and of course they are a great deal more like ourselves." "Wherefore it stands to reason that they must be a great deal nicer," he replied, with a glance which brought a brighter flush to her cheeks. Then he went on, "Ah, now I see the difference." "What difference? Between what?" "Between the daughter of Earth and the daughters of Ganymede," he replied. "You can blush, and I don't think they can. Haven't you noticed that, although they have the most exquisite skins and beautiful eyes and hair and all that sort of thing, not a man or woman of them has any colouring? I suppose that's the result of living for generations in a hothouse." "Very likely," she said. "But has it struck you also that all the girls and women are either beautiful or handsome, and all the men, except the ones that seem to be servants or slaves, are something like Greek gods, or at least the sort of men you see on the Greek sculptures? Survival of the fittest, I presume. These are probably the descendants of the highest races of Ganymede, the people who conceived the idea of prolonging the life of their race and were able to carry it out. The inferior races would either perish of starvation or become their servants. That's what will happen on Earth, and there is no reason why it shouldn't have happened here." As he said this, the car swung out round a broad curve into the centre of the great square, and a little cry of amazement broke from Zadie's lips as her glance roamed over the multiplying splendours about her. In the centre of the square, In the midst of smooth lawns and flower beds of every conceivable shape and color, and groves of flowering trees, stood a great domed building, which they approached through an avenue of overarching trees interlaced with flowering creepers. The car stopped at the foot of a triple flight of stairs of dazzling whiteness which led up to a broad arched doorway. Several groups of people were sprinkled about the avenue and steps, and the wide terrace which ran along the front of the building. They looked with keen but perfectly well-mannered surprise at their strange visitors, and seemed to be discussing their appearance, but not a step was taken towards them, nor was there the slightest sign of anything like vulgar curiosity. "Now, what perfect manners these dear people have," said Zaidie, as they dismounted at the foot of the staircase. "I wonder what would happen if a couple of them were to be landed from a motor car in front of the Capitol at Washington. I suppose this is their capital, and we've been brought here to be put through our facings. What a pity we can't talk to them. I wonder if they'd believe our story if we could tell it." "I've no doubt they know something of it already," replied Redgrave. "They're evidently people of immense intelligence. Intellectually, I dare say, we're mere children compared with them, and it's quite possible that they have developed senses which we have no idea of. And perhaps," added Zaidie, "all the time that we are talking to each other, our friend here is quietly reading everything that is going on in our minds." Whether this was so or not, their host gave no sign of comprehension. He led them up the steps and through the great doorway, where he was met by 3 splendidly dressed men even taller than himself. "I feel beastly shabby among all these gorgeously attired personages," said Redgrave, looking down at his plain tweed suit, as they were conducted with every manifestation of politeness along the magnificent vestibule into which the door opened. "And I'm sure I am quite a dowdy in comparison with these lovely creatures," added Zaidie, "although this dress was made in Paris. Lennox, if things are for sale here, you'll have to buy me one of those costumes, and we'll take it back and get one made like it. I wonder what they'd think of me dressed in one of those costumes at a ball at the Waldorf Astoria." Before he could make a suitable reply, a door at the end of the vestibule opened, and they were ushered into a large hall, which was evidently a council chamber. At the further end of it were 3 semicircular rows of seats made of a polished silvery metal, and in the centre, and raised slightly above them, another under a canopy of sky-blue silk. This seat, and 6 others, were occupied by men of most venerable aspect, in spite of the fact their hair was just as long and thick and glossy as their host's or even as Zaidie's own. The ceremony of introduction was exceedingly simple. Though they could not, of course, understand a word he said, it was evident from his eloquent gestures that their host described the way in which they had come from space and landed on the surface of the world of the Crystal Cities, as Zaidie subsequently rechristened Ganymede. The President of the Senate or Council spoke a few sentences in a deep musical tone. Then their host, taking their hands, led them up to his seat, and the President rose and took them by both hands in turn. Then, with a grave smile of greeting, he bent his head and resumed his seat. They joined hands in turn with each of the 6 senators present, bowed their farewells in silence, and then went back with their host to the car. They ran down the avenue, made a curving sweep round to the left, for all the paths in the great square were laid in curves, apparently to form a contrast to the straight streets, and presently stopped before the porch of one of the 100 palaces which surrounded it. This was their host's house, and their home during the rest of their sojourn on Ganymede. Chapter 16. The period of Ganymede's revolution round its gigantic primary is 7 days, 3 hours, and 43 minutes, practically a terrestrial week, and on their return to their native world, both the daring navigators of space describe this as the most interesting and delightful week in their lives, excepting always the period which they spent in the Eden of the Morning Star. Yet in one sense, it was even more interesting. There the inhabitants had never learnt to sin. Here they had learnt the lesson that sin is mere foolishness, and that no really sensible or properly educated man or woman thinks crime worth committing. The life of the Crystal Cities, of which they visited 4 in different parts of the satellite, using the Astronef as their vehicle, was one of peaceful industry and calm, innocent enjoyment. It was quite plain that their first impressions of this aged world were correct. Outside the cities spread a universal desert on which life was impossible. There was hardly any moisture in the thin atmosphere. The rivers had dwindled into rivulets, and the seas into vast, shallow marshes. The heat received from the sun was only about a 25th of that which falls on the surface of the earth, and this was drawn to the cities and collected and preserved under their glass domes by a number of devices which displayed superhuman intelligence. The dwindling supplies of water were hoarded in vast subterranean reservoirs, and, by means of a perfect system of redistillation, The priceless fluid was used over and over again, both for human purposes and for irrigating the land within the cities. Still, the total quantity was steadily diminishing, for it was not only evaporating from the surface, but, as the orb cooled more and more rapidly towards its center, it descended deeper and deeper below the surface, and could now only be reached by means of marvelously constructed borings and pumping machinery, which extended several miles below the surface. The fast-failing store of heat in the center of the little world, which had now cooled through more than half its bulk, was utilized for warming the air of the cities, and to drive the machinery which propelled it through the streets and squares. All work was done by electric energy developed directly from this source, which also actuated the repulsive engines which had prevented the Astronef from descending. In short, the inhabitants of Ganymede were engaged in a steady, ceaseless struggle to utilize the expiring natural forces of their world to prolong their own lives and the exquisitely refined civilization to which they had attained to the latest possible date. They were indeed in exactly the same position in which the distant descendants of the human race may one day be expected to find themselves. Their domestic life, as Zadie and Redgrave saw it while they were the guests of their host, was the perfection of simplicity and comfort, and their public life was characterized by a quiet but intense intellectuality which, as Zadie had said, made them feel very much like children who had only just learnt to speak. As they possessed magnificent telescopes, far surpassing any on Earth, their guests were able to survey, not only the solar system, but the other systems far beyond its limits, as no others of their kind had ever been able to do before. They did not look through or into the telescopes. The lens was turned upon the object, and this was thrown, enormously magnified, upon screens of what looked something like ground glass some 50 feet square. It was thus that they saw, not only the whole visible surface of Jupiter as he revolved above them and they about him, but also their native Earth, sometimes a pale silver disk or crescent close to the edge of the sun, visible only in the morning and the evening of Jupiter, and at other times like a little black spot crossing the glowing surface. But there was another development of the science of the crystal cities which interested them far more than this, for after all, they could not only see the worlds of space for themselves, but circumnavigate them if they chose. During their stay, they were shown on these same screens the pictorial history of the world whose guests they were. These pictures, which they recognized as an immeasurable development of what is called the cinematograph process on Earth, extended through the whole gamut of the satellite's life. They formed, in fact, the means by which the children of Ganymede were taught the history of their world. It was, of course, inevitable that the Astronef should prove an object of intense interest to their hosts. They had solved the problem of the resolution of forces, as Professor Rennick had done, and, as they were shown pictorially, a vessel had been made which embodied the principles of attraction and repulsion. It had risen from the surface of Ganymede, and then, possibly because its engines could not develop sufficient repulsive force, the tremendous pull of the giant planet had dragged it away. It had vanished through the cloud belts towards the flaming surface beneath, and the experiment had never been repeated. Here, however, was a vessel which had actually, as Redgrave had convinced his hosts by means of celestial maps and drawings of his own, left a planet close to the sun, and safely crossed the tremendous gulf of 650 million miles which separated Jupiter from the center of the system. Moreover, he had twice proved her powers by taking his host and two of his newly made friends, the chief astronomers of Ganymede, on a short trip across space to Callisto in Europa, the second satellite of Jupiter, which, to their very grave interest, they found had already passed the stage in which Ganymede was, and had lapsed into the icy silence of death. It was these two journeys which led to the last adventure of the Astronef in the Jovian system. Both Redgrave and Zadie had determined, at whatever risk, to pass through the cloud belts of Jupiter and catch a glimpse, if only a glimpse, of a world in the making. Their host and the two astronomers, after a certain amount of quiet discussion, accepted their invitation to accompany them, and on the morning of the 8th day after their landing on Ganymede, the Astronef rose from the plain outside the Crystal City and directed her course towards the center of the vast disk of Jupiter. She was followed by the telescopes of all the observatories until she vanished through the brilliant cloud band, 85,000 miles long and some 5,000 miles broad, which stretched from east to west of the planet. At the same moment, the voyagers lost sight of Ganymede and his sister satellites. The temperature of the interior of the Astronef began to rise as soon as the upper cloud belt was passed. Under this, spread out a vast field of brown-red cloud, rent here and there into holes and gaps like those storm cavities in the atmosphere of the sun, which are commonly known as sunspots. This lower stratum of cloud appeared to be the scene of terrific storms, compared with which the fiercest earthly tempests were mere zephyrs. After falling some 500 miles further, they found themselves surrounded by what seemed an ocean of fire, but still the internal temperature had only risen from 70 to 95. The engines were well under control. Only about a fourth of the total R force was being developed, and the Astronef was dropping swiftly but steadily. Redgrave, who was in the conning tower controlling the engines, beckoned to Zadie and said, "Shall we go on?" "Yes," she said. "Now we've got as far as this. I want to see what Jupiter is like, and where you are not afraid to go, I'll go." "If I'm afraid at all, it's only because you are with me, Zadie," he replied, "but I've only got a fourth of the power turned on yet, so there's plenty of margin." The Astronef, therefore, continued to sink through what seemed to be a fathomless ocean of whirling, blazing clouds, and the internal temperature went on rising slowly but steadily. Their guests, without showing the slightest sign of any emotion, walked about the upper deck now, singly and now together, apparently absorbed by the strange scene about them. At length, after they had been dropping for some 5 hours by Astronef time, one of them, uttering a sharp exclamation, pointed to an enormous rift about 50 miles away. A dull red glare was streaming up out of it. The next moment, the brown cloud floor beneath them seemed to split up into enormous wreaths of vapour which whirled up on all sides of them, and a few minutes later they caught their first glimpse of the true surface of Jupiter. It lay, as nearly as they could judge, some 2,000 miles beneath them, a distance which the telescopes reduced to less than 20, and they saw for a few moments the world that was in the making. Through floating seas of misty steam, they beheld what seemed to them to be vast continents shape themselves and melt away into oceans of flames. Whole mountain ranges of glowing lava were hurled up miles high, to take shape for an instant and then fall away again, leaving fathomless gulfs of fiery mist in their place. Then waves of molten matter rose up again out of the gulfs, tens of miles high and hundreds of miles long, surged forward and met with a concussion like that of millions of earthly thunderclouds. Minute after minute, they remained writhing and struggling with each other, flinging up spurts of flaming matter far above their crests. Other waves followed them, climbing up their bases as a sea surge runs up the side of a smooth, slanting rock. Then from the midst of them, a jet of living fire leapt up hundreds of miles into the lurid atmosphere above, and then, with a crash and a roar which shook the vast Jovian firmament, the battling lava waves would split apart and sink down into the all-surrounding fire ocean, like two grappling giants who had strangled each other in their final struggle. "It's just hell let loose," said Murgatroyd to himself, as he looked down upon the terrific scene through one of the portholes of the engine-room, "and, with all respect to my lord and her ladyship, those that come this near almost deserve to stop in it." Meanwhile, Redgrave and Zadie and their 3 guests were so absorbed in the tremendous spectacle that for a few moments no one noticed that they were dropping faster and faster towards the world which Murgatroyd, according to his lights, had not inaptly described. As for Zadie, all her fears were for the time being lost in wonder, until she saw her husband take a swift glance round upwards and downwards, and then go up into the conning tower. She followed him quickly and said, "What is the matter, Lennox? Are we falling too quickly?" "Much faster than we should," he replied, sending a signal to Murgatroyd to increase the force by 3/10. The answering signal came back, but still the Astronef continued to fall with terrific rapidity, and the awful landscape beneath them, a landscape of fire and chaos, broadened out and became more and more distinct. He sent 2 more signals down in quick succession. 3/4 of the whole repulsive power of the engines was now being exerted, a force which would have been sufficient to hurl the Astronef up from the surface of the earth like a feather in a whirlwind. Her downward course became a little slower, but still she did not stop. Zadie, white to the lips, looked down upon the hideous scene beneath and slipped her hand through Redgrave's arm. He looked at her for an instant, and then turned his head away with a jerk and sent down the last signal. The whole energy of the engines was now directing the maximum of the R force against the surface of Jupiter, but still, as every moment passed in a speechless agony of apprehension, it grew nearer and nearer. The fire waves mounted higher and higher, the roar of the fiery surges grew louder and louder. Then in a momentary lull, he put his arm round her, drew her close up to him and kissed her and said, "That's all we can do, dear. We've come too close and he's too strong for us." She returned his kiss and said quite steadily, "Well, at any rate, I'm with you, and it won't last long, will it?" Not very long now, I'm afraid, he said between his clenched teeth. And then he pulled her close to him again, and together they looked down into the storm, tossed hell towards which they were falling at the rate of nearly 100 miles a minute. Almost the next moment they felt a little jerk beneath their feet, a jerk upwards, and Redgrave shook himself out of the half-stupor into which he was falling and said, "Hullo, what's that? I believe we're stopping. Yes, we are, and we're beginning to rise too. Look, dear, the clouds are coming down upon us, fast too. I wonder what sort of miracle that is." "Eh, what's the matter, little woman?" Sadie's head had dropped heavily on his shoulder. A glance showed him that she had fainted. He could do nothing more in the conning tower, so he picked her up and carried her towards the companion, way past his 3 guests who were standing in the middle of the upper deck round a table on which lay a large sheet of paper. He took her below and laid her on her bed, and in a few minutes he had brought her to and told her that it was all right. Then he gave her a drink of brandy and water and went back to the upper deck. As he reached the top of the stairway, one of the astronomers came towards him with a sheet of paper in his hand, smiling gravely and pointing to a sketch upon it. He took the paper under one of the electric lights and looked at it. The sketch was a plan of the Jovian system. There were some signs written along one side, which he did not understand, but he divined that they were calculations. Still, there was no mistaking the diagram. There was a circle representing the huge bulk of Jupiter. There were 4 smaller circles at varying distances in a nearly straight line from it, and between the nearest of these and the planet was the figure of the Astronef, with an arrow pointing upwards. "Ah, I see," he said, forgetting for a moment that the other did not understand him. "That was the miracle." "The 4 satellites came into line with us just as the pull of Jupiter was getting too much for our engines, and their combined pull just turned the scale." "Well, thank God for that, sir, for in a few minutes more we should have been cinders." The astronomer smiled again as he took the paper back. Meanwhile, the Astronef was rushing upward like a meteor through the clouds. In 10 minutes the limits of the Jovian atmosphere were passed. Stars and suns and planets blazed out of the black vault of space, and the great disk of the world that is to be once more covered the floor of space beneath them, an ocean of cloud, covering continents of lava and seas of flame, the scene of the natal throes of a world which someday will be. They passed Io and Europa, which changed from new to full moons as they sped by towards the sun. And then the golden yellow crescent of Ganymede also began to fill out to the half and full disk, and by the 10th hour of Earth time, after they had risen from its surface, the Astronef was once more lying beside the gate of the Crystal City. At midnight on the 2nd night after their return, the ringed shape of Saturn, attended by his 8 satellites, hung in the zenith magnificently inviting. The Astronef's engines had been replenished after the exhaustion of their struggle with the might of Jupiter. They said farewell to their friends of the dying world. The doors of the air chamber closed. The signal tinkled in the engine room, and a few moments later, a blur of white lights on the brown background of the surrounding desert was all they could see of the Crystal City under whose domes they had seen and learnt so much. Chapter 17. The relative position of the 2 giants of the solar system at the moment when the Astronef left the surface of Ganymede was such that she had to make a journey of rather more than 340 million miles before she passed within the confines of the Saturnine system. At first her speed, as shown by the observations which Redgrave took with the instruments which Professor Rennick had designed for the purpose, was comparatively slow. This was due to the tremendous pull of Jupiter and its 4 moons on the fabric of the vessel. The backward drag rapidly decreased as the pull of Saturn and his system began to overmaster that of Jupiter. It so happened, too, that Uranus, the next outer planet of the solar system, 1,700,000,000 miles away from the Sun, was approaching its conjunction with Saturn, and so assisted in producing a constant acceleration of speed. Jupiter and his satellites dropped behind, sinking, as it seemed to the wanderers, down into the bottomless gulf of space, but still forming by far the most brilliant and splendid object in the skies. The far-distant Sun, which, seen from the Saturnian system, has only about a 19th of the superficial extent which it presents to the Earth, dwindled away rapidly until it began to look like a huge planet, with the Earth, Venus, Mars, and Mercury as satellites. Beyond the orbit of Saturn, Uranus, with his 8 moons, was shining with the lustre of a star of the first magnitude, and far above and beyond him again hung the pale disk of Neptune, the outer guard of the solar system, separated from the Sun by a gulf of more than 2,750,000,000 miles. When 2/3 of the distance between Jupiter and Saturn had been traversed, ringed orb lay beneath them like a vast globe, surrounded by an enormous circular ocean of many-coloured fire, divided, as it were, by circular shores of shade and darkness. On the side opposite to them, a gigantic conical shadow extended beyond the confines of the ocean of light. It was the shadow of half the globe of Saturn cast by the sun across his rings. 3 little dark spots were also travelling across the surface of the rings. They were the shadows of Mimas, Enceladus, and Tethys, the 3 inner satellites. Japetus, the most distant, which revolves at a distance 10 times greater than that of the Moon from the Earth, was rising to their left above the edge of the rings, a pale, yellow, little disk shining feebly against the black background of space. The rest of the 8 satellites were hidden behind the enormous bulk of the planet and the infinitely vaster area of the rings. Day after day, Sadie and her husband had been exhausting the possibilities of the English language in attempting to describe to each other the multiplying marvels of the wondrous scene which they were approaching at a speed of more than 100 miles a second, and at length Zadie, after nearly an hour's absolute silence, during which they sat with eyes fastened to their telescopes, looked up and said, "It's no use. Lenox." Now how the fine words that we've been trying to think of have just been wasted. The angels may have a language that you could describe that in, but we haven't. If it wouldn't be something like blasphemy, I should drop down to the commonplace and call Saturn a celestial spinning top with bands of light and shadow instead of colours all round it. Not at all a bad simile either, laughed Redgrave as he got up from his chair with a yawn and a stretch of his long limbs. Still, it's as well that you said celestial, for, after all, that's about the best word we've found yet. Certainly the ringed world is the most nearly heavenly thing we've seen so far. But, he went on, I think it's about time we were stopping this headlong fall of ours. Do you see how the landscape is spreading out round us? That means that we are dropping pretty fast. Whereabouts would you like to land? At present we're heading straight for Saturn's North Pole. I think I'd rather see what the rings are like first, said Zadie. Couldn't we go across them? Certainly we can, he replied, only we'll have to be a bit careful. Careful, what of? Collisions? Are you thinking of Proctor's hypothesis that the rings are formed of multitudes of tiny satellites? Yes, but I should go a little farther than that. I should say that his rings and his 8 satellites are to Saturn what the planets generally and the ring of the asteroids are to the Sun, and if that is the case, I mean if we find the rings made up of myriads of tiny bodies flying round with Saturn, it might get a bit risky. You see, the outside ring is a bit over 160,000 miles across, and it revolves in less than 11 hours. In other words, we might find the ring a sort of celestial maelstrom, and if we once got into the whirl, and Saturn exerted his full pull on us, we might become a satellite too, and go on swinging round with the rest for a good bit of eternity. Very well then, she said. Of course we don't want to do anything of that sort, but there's something else I think we could do. She went on, taking up a copy of Proctor's Saturn and its system, which she had been reading just after breakfast. You see, those rings are, altogether, about 10,000 miles broad. There's a gap of about 1,700 miles between the big dark one and the middle bright one, and it's nearly 10,000 miles from the edge of the bright ring to the surface of Saturn. Now, why shouldn't we get in between the inner ring and the planet? If Proctor was right and the rings are made of tiny satellites, and there are myriads of them, of course they'll pull up while Saturn pulls down. In fact, Flammarion says somewhere that along Saturn's equator there is no weight at all. Quite possible, replied Redgrave, and if you like, we'll go and prove it. Of course, if the Astronef weighs absolutely nothing between Saturn and the rings, we can easily get away. The only thing that I object to is getting into this 170,000-mile vortex, being whizzed round with Saturn every 10.5 hours, and sauntering round the sun at 21,000 miles an hour. Don't, she said. Really, it isn't good to think about these things, situated as we are. Fancy, in a single year of Saturn, there are nearly 25,000 Earth days. Why, we should each of us be about 30 years older when we got round, even if we lived, which, of course, we shouldn't. By the way, how long could we live for if the worst came to the worst? Given water, about 1 Earth year at the outside, but of course we shall be home long before that. If we don't become one of the satellites of Saturn, she replied, or get dragged away by something into the outer depths of space. Meanwhile, the downward speed of the Astronef had been considerably checked. The vast circle of the rings seemed to suddenly expand, and soon it covered the whole floor of the vault of space. As she dropped towards what might be called the limit of the northern tropic of Saturn, the spectacle presented by the rings became every minute more and more marvelous, purple and silver, black and gold, dotted with myriads of brilliant points of many-colored light. They stretched upwards like vast rainbows into the Saturnian sky as the Astronef's position changed with regard to the horizon of the planet. The nearer they approached the surface, the nearer the gigantic arch of the many-colored rings approached the zenith. Sun and stars sank down behind it, for now they were dropping through the 15-year-long twilight that reigns over that portion of the globe of Saturn which, during half of his year of 30 terrestrial years, is turned away from the sun. The further they fell towards the rings, the more certain it became that the theory of the great English astronomer was the correct one. Seen through the telescopes at a distance of only 30 or 40,000 miles, it became perfectly plain that the outer or darker ring, as seen from the Earth, was composed of myriads of tiny bodies so far separated from each other that the rayless blackness of space could be seen through them. "It's quite evident," said Redgrave, after a long look through his telescope, "that those are rings of what we should call meteorites on Earth, atoms of matter which Saturn threw off into space after the satellites were formed." "And I shouldn't wonder, if you will excuse my interrupting you," said Zaidie, "if the moons themselves have been made up of a lot of these things going together when they were only gas or nebula, or something of that sort. In fact, when Saturn was a good deal younger than he is now, he may have had a lot more rings and no moons, and now these aerolites, or whatever they are, can't come together and make moons because they've got too solid." Meanwhile, the Astronef was rapidly approaching that portion of Saturn's surface which was illuminated by the rays of the sun, streaming under the lower arch of the inner ring. As they passed under it, the whole scene suddenly changed. The rings vanished. Overhead was an arch of brilliant light 100 miles thick, spanning the whole of the visible heavens. Below lay the sunlit surface of Saturn, divided into light and dark bands of enormous breadth. The band immediately below them was of a brilliant silver grey, very much like the central zone of Jupiter. North of this, on the one side, stretched the long shadow of the rings, and southward other bands of alternating white and gold and deep purple succeeded each other till they were lost in the curvature of the vast planet. The poles were of course invisible, since the Astronef was now too near the surface, but on their approach they had seen unmistakable evidence of snow and ice. As soon as they were exactly under the ring arch, Redgrave shut off the R-force, and, somewhat to their astonishment, the Astronef began to revolve slowly on its axis, giving them the idea that the Saturnian system was revolving round them. The arch seemed to sink beneath their feet, while the belts of the planet rose above them. "What on earth is the matter?" said Zaidie. "Everything has gone upside down." "Which shows," replied Redgrave, "that as soon as the Astronef became neutral, the rings pulled harder than the planet, I suppose because we're so near to them, and instead of falling onto Saturn, we shall have to push up at him." "Oh yes, I see that," said Zaidie, "but after all it does look a little bit bewildering, doesn't it? To be on your feet 1 minute, and on your head the next." "It is rather, but you ought to be getting accustomed to that sort of thing now. In a few minutes, neither you nor I, nor anything else will have any weight. We shall be just between the attraction of the rings and Saturn, so you'd better go and sit down, for if you were to give a bit of an extra spring in walking, you might be knocking that pretty head of yours against the roof," said Redgrave, as he went to turn the R-force onto the edge of the rings. A vast sea of silver cloud seemed now to descend upon them. Then they entered it, and for nearly half an hour the Astronef was totally enveloped in a sea of pearl-grey luminous mist. "Atmosphere," said Redgrave, as he went to the conning tower and signalled to Murgatroyd to start the propellers. They continued to rise, and the mist began to drift past them in patches, showing that the propellers were driving them ahead. They now rose swiftly towards the surface of the planet. The cloud rack got thinner and thinner, and presently they found themselves floating in a clear atmosphere between two seas of cloud, the one above them being much less dense than the one below. "I believe we shall see Saturn on the other side of that," said Zaidie, looking up at it. "Oh dear, there we are going round again." "Reaching the point of neutral attraction," said Redgrave. "Once more you'd better sit down in case of accidents." Instead of dropping into her deck chair as she would have done on Earth, she took hold of the arms and pulled herself into it, saying, "Really, it seems rather absurd to have to do this sort of thing. Fancy having to hold yourself into a chair. I suppose I hardly weigh anything at all now." "Not much," said Redgrave, stooping down and taking hold of the end of the chair with both hands. Without any apparent effort, he raised her about 5 feet from the floor and held her there while the Astronef made another revolution. For a moment he let go, and she and the chair floated between the roof and the floor of the deck chamber. And he pulled the chair away from under her, and as the floor of the vessel once more turned towards Saturn, he took hold of her hands and brought her to her feet on deck again. "I ought to have had a photograph of you like that," he laughed. "I wonder what they'd think of it at home. If you had taken one, I should certainly have broken the negative. The very idea, a photograph of me standing on nothing. Besides, they'd never believe it on Earth." "We might have got old Andrew to make an affidavit as to the true circumstances," he began. "Don't talk nonsense, Lennox. Look, there's something much more interesting. There's Saturn at last. Now I wonder if we shall find any sort of life there. And shall we be able to breathe the air?" "I hardly think so," he said as the Astronef dropped slowly through the thin cloud veil. "You know, spectrum analysis has proved that there is a gas in Saturn's atmosphere which we know nothing about. And, however good it may be for the Saturnians, it's not very likely that it would agree with us, so I think we'd better be content with our own. Besides, the atmosphere is so enormously dense that even if we could breathe it, it might squash us up. You see, we're only accustomed to 15 pounds on the square inch, and it may be hundreds of pounds here." "Well," said Zadie, "I haven't got any particular desire to be flattened out or squeezed dry like an orange. It's not at all a nice idea, is it? But look, Lennox," she went on, pointing downwards, "surely this isn't air at all, or at least it's something between air and water. Aren't those things swimming about in it? Something like fish in the sea. They can't be clouds, and they aren't either fish or birds. They don't fly or float. Well, this is certainly more wonderful than anything else we've seen, though it doesn't look very pleasant. They're not nice looking, are they? I wonder if they are at all dangerous." While she was saying this, Zadie had gone to her telescope and was sweeping the surface of Saturn, which was now about 100 miles distant. Her husband was doing the same. In fact, for the time being, they were all eyes, for they were looking on a stranger sight than man or woman had ever seen before. Underneath the inner cloud, veiled, the atmosphere of Saturn appeared to them somewhat as the lower depths of the ocean would appear to a diver, granted that he was able to see for hundreds of miles about him. Its colour was a pale greenish yellow. The outside thermometers showed that the temperature was 175 Fahrenheit. In fact, the interior of the Astronef was getting uncomfortably like a Turkish bath, and Redgrave took the opportunity of at once freshening and cooling the air by releasing a little oxygen from the cylinders. From what they could see of the surface of Saturn, it seemed to be a dead level, greyish-brown in colour and not divided into oceans and continents. In fact, there were no signs whatever of water within range of their telescopes. There was nothing that looked like cities or any human habitations, but the ground, as they got nearer to it, seemed to be covered with a very dense vegetable growth, not unlike gigantic forms of seaweed and of somewhat the same colour. In fact, as Zadie remarked, the surface of Saturn was not at all unlike what the floors of the ocean of the Earth might be if they were laid bare. It was evident that the life of this portion of Saturn was not what, for want of a more exact word, might be called terrestrial. Its inhabitants, however they were constituted, floated about in the depths of this semi-gaseous ocean as the denizens of earthly seas did in the terrestrial oceans. Already their telescopes enabled them to make out enormous moving shapes, black and grey, brown and pale red, swimming about, evidently by their own volition, rising and falling and often sinking down onto the gigantic vegetation which covered the surface, possibly for the purpose of feeding. But it was also evident that they resembled the inhabitants of earthly oceans in another respect, since it was easy to see that they preyed upon each other. "I don't like the look of those creatures at all," said Zadie, when the Astronef had come to a stop and was floating about 10 miles above the surface. "They're altogether too uncanny. They look to me something like jellyfish about the size of whales, only they have eyes and mouths. Did you ever see such awful-looking eyes, bigger than soup plates and as bright as a cat's? I suppose that's because of the dim light, and the nasty wormy sort of way they swim, or fly, or whatever it is. Lennox, I don't know what the rest of Saturn may be like, but I certainly don't like this part. It's quite too creepy and unearthly for my taste. Look at the horrors fighting and eating each other. That's the only bit of earthly character they've got about them, the big ones eating the little ones. I hope they won't take the Astronef for something nice to eat." "They'd find her a pretty tough morsel if they did," laughed Redgrave, "but still we may as well get some steering way on her in case of accident." Chapter 18. A few moments later he sent a signal to Murgatroyd in the engine room. The propellers began to revolve slowly, beating the dense air and driving the Astronef at a speed of about 20 miles an hour through the depths of this strangely peopled ocean. They approached nearer and nearer to the surface, and as they did so, the uncanny creatures about them grew more and more numerous. They were certainly the most extraordinary living things that human eyes had ever looked upon. Zadie's comparison to the whale and the jellyfish was by no means incorrect. Only when they got near enough to them they found, to their astonishment, that they were double-headed. That is to say, they had a head with a mouth, nostrils, ear-holes and eyes at each end of their bodies. The larger of the creatures appeared to have a certain amount of respect for each other. Now and then they witnessed a battle royal between two of the monsters who were pursuing the same prey. Their method of attack was as follows. The assailant would rise above his opponent or prey, and then, dropping onto its back, envelop it and begin tearing at its sides and under parts with huge beak-like jaws, somewhat resembling those of the largest kind of the earthly octopus, only infinitely more formidable. The substance composing their bodies appeared to be not unlike that of a terrestrial jellyfish, but much denser. It seemed from their motions to have the tenacity of soft indiarubber, save at the headed ends, where it was much harder. The necks were protected for about 50 feet by huge scales of a dull greenish hue. When one of them had overpowered an enemy or a victim, the two sank down into the vegetation, and the victor began to eat the vanquished. Their means of locomotion consisted of huge fins, or rather half fins, half wings, of which they had 3 laterally arranged behind each head, and 4 much longer and narrower, above and below, which seemed to be used mainly for steering purposes. They moved with equal ease in either direction, and they appeared to rise or fall by inflating or deflating the middle portions of their bodies, somewhat as fish do with their swimming bladders. The light in the lower regions of this strange ocean was dimmer than earthly twilight, although the Astronef was steadily making her way beneath the arch of the rings towards the sunlit hemisphere. "I wonder what the effect of the searchlight would be on these fellows," said Redgrave. "Those huge eyes of theirs are evidently only suited to dim light. Let's try and dazzle some of them." "I hope it won't be a case of the moths and the candle," said Zadie. "They don't seem to have taken much interest in us so far. Perhaps they haven't been able to see properly. But suppose they were attracted by the light and began crowding round us and fastening onto us, as the horrible things do with each other. What should we do then? They might drag us down and perhaps keep us there, but there's one thing, they'd never eat us, because we could keep closed up and die respectably together." "Not much fear of that, little woman," he said. "We're too strong for them. Hardened steel and toughened glass ought to be more than a match for a lot of exaggerated jellyfish like these," said Redgrave, as he switched on the head searchlight. "We've come here to see strange things, and we may as well see them. Ah, would you, my friend? No, this is not one of your sort, and it isn't meant to eat." An enormous double-headed monster, apparently some 400 feet long, came floating towards them as the searchlight flashed out, and others began instantly to crowd about them, just as Zadie had feared. "Lennox, for heaven's sake, be careful!" cried Zadie, shrinking up beside him as the huge, hideous head, with its saucer eyes and enormous beak-like jaws wide open, came towards them. "And look, there are more coming. Can't we go up and get away from them?" "Wait a minute, little woman," replied Redgrave, who was beginning to feel the passion of adventure thrilling along his nerves. "If we fought the Martian air fleet and licked it, I think we can manage these things. Let's see how he likes the light." As he spoke, he flashed the full glare of the 5,000 candle power lamp full onto the creature's great cat-like eyes. Instantly it bent itself up into an arc. The two heads, each the exact image of the other, came together. The 4 eyes glared half-dazzled into the conning tower, and the 4 fearful jaws snapped viciously together. "Lennox! Lennox! For goodness sake, let us go up!" cried Zadie, shrinking still closer to him. "That thing's too horrible to look at." "It is a beast, isn't it?" he said, "but I think we can cut him in 2 without much trouble." He signalled for full speed. The Astronef ought to have sprung forward and driven her ram through the huge, brick-red body of the hideous creature, which was now only a couple of 100 yards from them. But instead of that, a slow, jarring, grinding thrill seemed to run through her, and she stopped. The next moment, Murgatroyd put his head up through the companion, way which led from the upper deck to the conning tower, and said, in a tone whose calm indicated, as usual, resignation to the worst that could happen, "My lord, 2 of those beasts, fishes or live balloons, or whatever they are, have come across the propellers. They're cut up a good bit, but I've had to stop the engines, and they're clinging all round the after part. We're going down, too. Shall I disconnect the propellers and turn on the repulsion?" "Yes, certainly, Andrew," cried Zadie, "and all of it, too. Look, Lennox, that horrible thing is coming. Suppose it broke the glass, and we couldn't breathe this atmosphere." As she spoke, the enormous double-headed body advanced until it completely enveloped the forward part of the Astronef. The 2 hideous heads came close to the sides of the conning tower, The huge, palely luminous eyes looked in upon them. Zaidi, in her terror, even thought that she saw something like human curiosity in them. Then, as Murgatroyd disappeared to obey the orders which Redgrave had sanctioned with a quick nod, the heads approached still closer, and she heard the ends of the pointed jaws, which she now saw were armed with shark-like teeth, striking against the thick glass walls of the conning tower. "Don't be frightened, dear," he said, putting his arm round her, just as he had done when they thought they were falling into the fiery seas of Jupiter. "You'll see something happen to this gentleman soon. Big and all as he is, there won't be much left of him in a few minutes. They're like those monsters they found in the lowest depths of our own seas. They can only live under tremendous pressure. That's why we didn't find any of them up above. This chap'll burst like a bubble presently. Meanwhile, there's no use in stopping here. Suppose you go below and brew some coffee and bring it up on deck while I go and see how things are looking aft. It doesn't do you any good, you know, to be looking at monsters of this sort. You can see what's left of them later on. You might bring the cognac decanter up too." Zaidie was not at all sorry to obey him, for the horrible sight had almost sickened her. They were still under the arch of the rings, and so, when the full strength of the R-force was directed against the body of Saturn, the vessel sprang upwards like a projectile fired from a cannon. Redgrave went back into the conning tower to see what happened to their assailant. It was already trying to detach itself and sink back into a more congenial element. As the pressure of the atmosphere decreased, its huge body swelled up into still huger proportions. The scaly skin on the two heads and necks puffed up as though air was being pumped in under it. The great eyes protruded out of their sockets. The jaws opened widely as though the creature were gasping for breath. Meanwhile, Murgatroyd was seeing something very similar at the after end and wondering what was going to happen to his propellers, the blades of which were deeply embedded in the jelly-like flesh of the monsters. The Astronef leaped higher and higher, and the hideous bodies which were clinging to her swelled out huger and huger. Redgrave even fancied that he heard something like the cries of pain from both heads on either side of the conning tower. They passed through the inner cloud veil, and then the Astronef began to turn on her axis, and, just as the outer envelope came into view, the enormously distended bulk of the monsters collapsed, and their fragments, seeming now like the tatters of a burst balloon than portions of a once-living creature, dropped from the body of the Astronef and floated away down into what had been their native element. "Difference of environment means a lot, after all," said Redgrave to himself. "I should have called that either a lie or a miracle if I hadn't seen it, and I'm jolly glad I sent Zaidie down below." "Here's your coffee, Lennox," said her voice from the upper deck the next moment, "only it doesn't seem to want to stop in the cups, and the cups keep getting off the saucers. I suppose we're turning upside down again." Redgrave stepped somewhat gingerly onto the deck, for his body had so little weight under the double attraction of Saturn and the rings that a very slight effort would have sent him flying up to the roof of the deck chamber. "That's exactly as you please," he said. "Just hold that table steady a minute. We shall have our centre of gravity back soon. And now, as to the main question, suppose we take a trip across the sunlit hemisphere of Saturn to, what I suppose we should call on Earth, the South Pole. We can get resistance from the rings, and as we are here, we may as well see what the rest of Saturn is like. You see, if our theory is correct as to the rings gathering up most of the atmosphere of Saturn about its equator, we shall get to higher latitudes where the air is thinner and more like our own, and therefore it's quite possible that we shall find different forms of life in it too. Or if you've had enough of Saturn and would prefer a trip to Uranus—" "No, thanks," said Zaidie quickly. "To tell you the truth, Lennox, I've had almost enough star-wandering for one honeymoon, and though we've seen nice things as well as horrible things, especially those ghastly, slimy creatures down there, I'm beginning to feel a bit homesick for good old Mother Earth. You see, we're nearly 1,000 million miles from home, and, even with you, it makes one feel a bit lonely. I vote we explore the rest of this hemisphere up to the pole, and then, as they say at sea, I mean our sea, 'bout ship, and try if we can find our own old world again. After all, it is more homelike than any of these, isn't it? Just take our telescope and look at it," said Redgrave, pointing towards the sun, with its little cluster of attendant planets. "It looks something like one of Jupiter's little moons down there, doesn't it? Only not quite as big." "Yes, it does, but that doesn't matter. The fact is that it's there, and we know what it's like, and it's home, if it is 1,000 million miles away, and that's everything." By this time they had passed through the outer band of clouds. The vast, sunlit arch of the rings towered up to the zenith, apparently spanning the whole visible heavens. Below and in front of them lay the enormous semicircle of the hemisphere, which was turned towards the sun, shrouded by its many-coloured bands of clouds. The R-force was directed strongly against the lower ring, and the Astronef descended rapidly in a slanting direction through the cloud bands towards the southern temperate zone of the planet. They passed through the second, or dark, cloud band at the rate of about 3,000 miles an hour, aided by the repulsion against the rings and the attraction of the planets, and soon after lunch, the materials of which now consented to remain on the table, they passed through the clouds and found themselves in a new world of wonders. On a far vaster scale, it was the Earth during that period of its development, which is called the Reptilian Age. The atmosphere was still dense and loaded with aqueous vapour, but the waters had already been divided from the land. They passed over vast, marshy continents and islands, and warm seas, above which thin clouds of steam still hung, and as they swept southward with the propellers working at their utmost speed, they caught glimpses of giant forms rising out of the steamy waters near the land, of others crawling slowly over it, dragging their huge bulk through a tremendous vegetation, which they crushed down as they passed, as a sheep on earth might push its way through a field of standing corn. Other and even stranger shapes, broad-winged and ungainly, fluttered with a slow, bat-like motion through the lower strata of the atmosphere. Every now and then, during the voyage across the temperate zone, the propellers were slowed down to enable them to witness some titanic conflict between the gigantic denizens of land and sea and air. But Zadie had had enough of horrors on the Saturnian equator, and so she was content to watch this phase of evolution working itself out, as it had done on the Earth thousands of ages ago, from a convenient distance. Wherefore, the Astronef sped on without approaching the surface nearer than was necessary to get a clear general view. "It'll be all very nice to see and remember and dream about afterwards," she said, "but I don't think I can stand any more monsters just now, at least not at close quarters, and I'm quite sure that if those things can live there we couldn't, any more than we could have lived on Earth 1,000,000 years or so ago. No, really, I don't want to land. Lennox, let's go on." They went on at a speed of about 100 miles an hour, and, as they progressed southward, both the atmosphere and the landscape rapidly changed. The air grew clearer and the clouds lighter. Land and sea were more sharply divided, and both teeming with life. The seas still swarmed with serpentine monsters of the saurian type, and the firmer lands were peopled by huge animals, mastodons, bears, giant tapirs, mylodons, dinotheriums, and a score of other species too strange for them to recognize by any earthly likeness, which roamed in great herds through the vast twilit forests and over boundless plains covered with grey-blue vegetation. Here, too, they found mountains for the first time on Saturn, mountains steep-sided and many earth-miles high. As the Astronef was skirting the side of one of these ranges, Redgrave allowed it to approach more closely than he had so far done to the surface of Saturn. "I shouldn't wonder if we found some of the higher forms of life up here," he said. "If there is any kind of being that is going to develop some day into the human race of Saturn, it would naturally get up here." "I should hope so," said Zadie, "and just as far as possible out of the reach of those unutterable horrors on the equator. That would be one of the first signs they would show of superior intelligence. Look, I believe there are some of them. Do you see those holes in the mountainside there? And there they are, something like gorillas, only twice as big, and up the trees too. And what trees? They must be 700 or 800 feet high. Tree-men and cave-dwellers, and ancestors of the future royal race of Saturn, I suppose," said Redgrave. "They don't look very nice, do they? Still, there's no doubt about their being far superior in intelligence to those other brutes we saw. Evidently, this atmosphere is too thin for the two-headed jellyfishes and the saurians to breathe. These creatures have found that out in a few hundreds of generations, and so they have come to live up here out of the way. Vegetarians, I suppose, or perhaps they live on smaller monkeys and other animals, just as our ancestors did." "Really, Lennox," said Zadie, turning round and facing him, "I must say that you have a most unpleasant way of alluding to one's ancestors." "I couldn't help what they were." "Well, dear," he said, going towards her, "marvellous as the miracle seems, I'm heretic enough to believe it possible that your ancestors even, millions of years ago perhaps, may have been something like those. But then, of course, you know I'm a hopeless Darwinian, and therefore entirely horrid, as I've often said before when you get on subjects like these. Not, of course, that I'm ashamed of my poor relations, and then, after all, your Darwin was quite wrong when he talked about the descent of man and woman. We, especially the women, have ascended from that sort of thing, if there's any truth in the story at all, though personally I must say I prefer dear old Mother Eve." who never had a sweeter daughter than— Very prettily put, my lord, she laughed, releasing herself with a gentle twirl. And now I'll go and get dinner ready. After all, it doesn't matter what world one's in, one gets hungry all the same. The dinner, which was eaten somewhere in the middle of the 15-year-long day of Saturn, was a more than usually pleasant one, because they were now nearing the turning point of their trip into the depths of space, and thoughts of home and friends were already beginning to fly back across the 1,000-million-mile gulf which lay between them and the Earth which they had left only a little more than 2 months ago. While they were at dinner, the Astronef rose above the mountains and resumed her southward course. Zadie brought the coffee up on deck as usual after dinner, and, while Redgrave smoked his cigar and Zadie her cigarette, they luxuriated in the magnificent spectacle of the sunlit side of the rings towering up, rainbow built on rainbow, to the zenith of their visible heavens. "What a pity there aren't any words to describe it," said Zadie. "I wonder if the descendants of the ancestors of the future human race on Saturn will invent anything like a suitable language. I wonder how they'll talk about those rings millions of years hence." "By that time there may not be any rings," Lennox replied, blowing one of blue smoke from his own lips. "Look at that. Made in a moment and gone in a moment, and yet on exactly the same principle, it gives one a dim idea of the difference between time and eternity. After all, it's only another example of Kelvin's theory of vortices. Nebula and asteroids and planet rings and smoke rings are really all made on the same principle. My dear Lennox, if you're going to get as philosophical and as commonplace as that, I'm going to bed. Now that I come to think of it, I've been up about 15 Earth hours, so it's about time I went and had a sleep. It's your turn to make the coffee in the morning. Our morning, I mean, and you'll wake me in time to see the south pole of Saturn, won't you? You're not coming yet, I suppose?" "Not just yet, dear. I want to see a bit more of this, and then I must go through the engines and see that they're all right and ready for that 1,000-million-mile homeward voyage you're talking about. You can have a good 10 hours sleep without missing much, I think, for there doesn't seem to be anything more interesting than our own Arctic life down there. So good night, little woman, and don't have too many nightmares." "Good night," she said. "If you hear me shout, you'll know that you're to come and protect me from monsters. Weren't those two-headed brutes just too horrid for words? Good night, dear."